"Family isn't allowed tonight, sir." That was the first thing the guard said to me. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him, because I was standing there in a pressed charcoal suit, holding an invitation with my daughter's name printed in gold lettering across the top. And yet the way he looked at me, flat, dismissive, already moving on, made it clear he wasn't mistaken. He had already decided exactly who I was before I even opened my mouth. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet, precise awareness that this moment mattered more than it should have, that something about it didn't fit. And I've spent enough years building things, watching patterns, reading people, to know when something is off before anyone else notices. So I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked past him through the glass doors of the ballroom, because they were spotless, polished to a mirror shine, and through them I could see everything I needed to see. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light. Across a sea of tailored suits and silk dresses, waiters moving in smooth lines with trays of champagne. And right in the center of it all, beneath a white banner stretched across the back wall, was my daughter Claire, standing tall, smiling the way she used to when she was 10 years old and proud of something she'd done. Except this smile was different, sharper, practiced. The kind of smile you wear when people are watching and you know exactly what they expect to see. Senior Vice President Claire Whitmore, the banner read, bold black letters on white. And I watched as she lifted a glass, nodded to someone just out of frame, and the room responded to her, leaned toward her, as if she had always belonged there, as if she had built it herself. And I realized then that nobody inside that room was looking toward the doors. Nobody was wondering if someone was missing. Nobody was asking why her father wasn't there. And that was when the guard shifted slightly, stepping just enough into my path to make the boundary clear, his hand hovering near my arm, not touching, but close enough to suggest he would if he had to. "I need you to step back, sir," he said. His voice calm, professional, rehearsed, and I nodded once, because he was doing his job. I could see that. But jobs like his rely on assumptions, on quick judgments about who belongs and who doesn't. And right now, I was standing on the wrong side of that judgment, holding a piece of paper that suddenly meant nothing. And behind me, I could feel movement, the quiet shuffle of other guests arriving, the low murmur of conversation. A man in an expensive navy suit pausing just long enough to glance at me before turning away, already uninterested, already certain I wasn't part of whatever mattered inside those doors. And I followed his gaze back to the glass, back to Claire, just in time to see her turn slightly, her eyes drifting toward the entrance, toward me. And for a fraction of a second, we made eye contact, clear and unmistakable, and I waited, not for recognition, not even for a smile, just for the smallest shift, the kind that says I see you, I know you're there. But instead her expression held, perfectly composed. And then she looked away, turning back to the man beside her, leaning in as he spoke, her laughter rising just enough for me to hear it faintly through the glass. And in that moment, the space between us felt wider than the entire room, wider than the years I had spent making sure she never had to worry about anything, wider than the distance between being invited and being welcome. And I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a mistake at the door, it was a decision, and I was standing outside of it. I did not move right away, and that seemed to confuse him more than if I had argued, because people expect resistance when they draw a line like that. They expect noise, explanations, maybe even embarrassment, but silence makes them uncomfortable. Silence forces them to look a second time, and I could feel that shift as the guard's eyes lingered on me just a fraction longer than before, trying to reconcile what he saw with the decision he had already made. And I let him look, because there was nothing in my appearance that contradicted his assumption, nothing that signaled authority or ownership or control, just a man in his 60s standing alone at the entrance of a room he was not allowed to enter, holding an invitation that might as well have been blank. And behind him the doors opened briefly as a group of guests stepped through, a burst of music and laughter spilling out into the hallway before being cut off again. And for a second the smell of expensive cologne and polished wood reached me, familiar in a way that most people would not recognize, because I had walked through rooms like that for decades, long before Claire ever knew what a board meeting looked like, long before she learned how to hold a glass of champagne without leaving fingerprints on the stem. And I watched as the guard checked his list again, his finger moving down a column of names that did not include mine. "If you have an invitation, I can take it and have someone verify," he said, softer now, less certain, as if he was offering me a way to leave without losing face, and I considered it for a moment, not because I needed verification, but because I wanted to see how far this line extended, how deep this decision went. So I handed him the card, feeling the weight of it leave my fingers, and he took it with a quick, practiced motion, glanced at it, then glanced back at me, and I saw the flicker of hesitation, the moment where something did not quite add up, but instead of questioning it, he defaulted to the system in front of him, the list, the protocol, the simple rule that had already categorized me. "I will have to confirm with the event coordinator," he said, stepping slightly to the side, speaking into his radio in a low voice. And I stood there, listening to the static, to the fragments of conversation I could not fully make out. And then another voice came through, clear enough for both of us to hear. "No additional guests. Keep the list tight." And that was it. The decision reinforced from somewhere inside, somewhere higher up in the chain, and the guard handed the invitation back to me with a polite nod that felt final. "I am sorry, sir, but I cannot let you in." And I took the card without looking at it, because I already knew what it said. I had read that name more times than I could count over the years, signed it on school forms, medical papers, documents that carried far more weight than this piece of cardstock ever would. And I slipped it into my jacket pocket as if it still mattered. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us settling into something quiet and defined. And then I heard a voice from behind the doors, amplified slightly. Someone tapping a microphone, calling for attention, and the music faded just enough for the room to listen. And through the glass I saw Claire step forward, guided by a man in a dark suit who rested his hand lightly at her back, positioning her under the banner like she belonged there, like she had earned every inch of that space on her own. And the man lifted the microphone, saying her name again, full and clear, "Claire Whitmore." And the room responded, a wave of applause rising around her. And I watched her nod, watched her accept it, her posture straight, her expression composed. And there was no trace of hesitation, no sign that anything outside those doors existed at all. And I realized then that this was not just about being kept out. It was about being removed from the story entirely, edited out of the version of events being presented inside that room. And I have seen that happen before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in quiet restructurings where people become irrelevant overnight because someone higher up decides they are, and the mechanism is always the same. It starts small, a missed name on a list, a quiet exclusion, a door that does not open. And by the time anyone notices, the reality has already shifted. And I felt that shift now, precise and undeniable. And the guard shifted his weight again, glancing at me as if waiting for me to leave, as if the scene was over. But I remained where I was, not out of defiance, but because I wanted to see one more thing. I wanted to confirm what I already suspected, so I kept my eyes on Claire as the applause faded and she leaned slightly toward the microphone, preparing to speak. And for just a moment, before she opened her mouth, her gaze moved again, not searching this time, not uncertain, but deliberate, and it landed on the doors, on the reflection of me standing outside. And I saw it clearly, the recognition, the awareness, the knowledge of exactly who I was and where I stood. And then, just as quickly, she shifted her focus back to the room, lifted her chin, and began to speak as if nothing else existed. I stood there and listened as her voice carried through the glass, steady and confident, the kind of voice that does not hesitate because it has been practiced, refined, shaped to fit rooms exactly like this one. And I could not hear every word, not clearly, but I did not need to, because I recognized the cadence, the pauses, the way she let certain phrases land before continuing, the way she acknowledged the people around her as if she belonged among them. And for a moment, I let myself focus on that, on the technical perfection of it, because it was easier than focusing on what was missing, easier than asking why there was no acknowledgement of the years that came before this night, no trace of the foundation that made that moment possible. And I felt something settle deeper inside me, not resentment, not even disappointment in the way most people understand it, but a kind of clarity that comes when a pattern finally completes itself, when all the small inconsistencies you have been noticing begin to align into something undeniable, and I realized that this night had not started at the door. It had been building for a long time, in quiet decisions, in conversations I was not part of, in choices that seemed small at the time, but carried weight I had not fully measured. And the guard shifted again beside me, glancing toward the doors as the applause rose once more, then back at me, as if trying to decide whether to say something else, whether to offer another explanation or simply wait me out. And I saved him the trouble by speaking first, my voice calm. Even, "It is a full house tonight." And he nodded, relieved to have something neutral to agree with. "Yes, sir, it is a private event," he said, and I watched his posture relax slightly, the tension easing now that I was no longer a problem to solve, just a man lingering where he should not be. And I looked past him again, not at Claire this time, but at the room itself, at the people moving through it, the executives clustered near the stage, the assistants hovering just out of frame, the subtle hierarchy that most people never notice, but that becomes obvious once you have spent enough time inside it. And I saw the familiar dynamics at play, the way power organizes itself without needing to announce it, the way certain individuals draw attention while others orbit quietly around them. And I could almost map it in my mind, the structure, the reporting lines, the influence that flowed beneath the surface. And it was all still there, unchanged in its fundamentals, even if the faces had shifted, even if the narrative inside the room had evolved to exclude me. And that was when I noticed the small details that most people would miss, the logo placement on the banners, the arrangement of the tables, the specific executives who were present and the ones who were not. And each detail confirmed what I already knew, that this was not just a celebration, it was a statement, a carefully constructed moment designed to signal something to the people who mattered. And Claire was at the center of it, positioned exactly where she needed to be, saying exactly what she needed to say. And for a moment I allowed myself to consider the possibility that she believed this version of the story, that she had convinced herself that everything she was claiming was entirely her own, that the path she stood on had appeared beneath her feet without any hidden support. And that thought did not make me angry. It made me precise. It sharpened something in me that had been quiet for a long time, because I understood then that this was not about correcting a misunderstanding or stepping back into a role I had been removed from. This was about recognizing the reality as it existed now, not as it had been, and deciding what to do with that reality. And I slipped my hands into my coat pockets, feeling the familiar weight of my phone resting there, a small, simple object that connected to systems far larger than anything visible in that room. And I let my fingers rest against it without taking it out. Not yet, because timing matters in ways most people underestimate. And I have learned over the years that the difference between a reaction and a decision is often just a matter of waiting long enough to see the full picture. And the picture in front of me was almost complete. Almost. And I looked at Claire one more time as she finished her remarks, as the applause rose again and she stepped back, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, smiling for the people who would carry her name forward in rooms I had once walked through myself. And I saw no hesitation, no uncertainty, just confidence built on a foundation she no longer acknowledged. And that was the final piece, the confirmation I needed. And I exhaled slowly, a quiet, controlled breath that marked the end of observation and the beginning of something else, something deliberate, something already set in motion long before this night ever began. I finally reached into my coat and took out my phone, not in a rush, not with any visible urgency, but with the same measured pace I had used when signing contracts that moved millions of dollars without a single raised voice. Because there is a rhythm to decisions like this, a sequence that matters more than the action itself. And I unlocked the screen, my thumb steady, my expression unchanged. And for a brief second the reflection of the ballroom lights flickered across the glass, distorted and distant, like something I used to belong to but no longer needed to touch directly. And I scrolled past a handful of notifications without reading them. None of them important, none of them connected to what was about to happen. And then I stopped on a name that had not changed in over 20 years, a name that most people in that building would recognize immediately if they ever saw it displayed, but a name that never appeared on public lists, never attached to announcements or celebrations, because that was never its function. And I tapped it once, bringing the number up, and let it sit there for a moment without pressing call, because I wanted to be certain, not about what I was going to do, but about why I was doing it, and that distinction has always mattered to me. The difference between acting out of impulse and acting out of clarity, and everything I had seen tonight had given me that clarity, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to question, and I pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear as the line connected almost immediately, not because I expected it to, but because systems that are built correctly tend to respond when they are needed. And I heard a voice on the other end, calm, attentive. "Daniel," he said, no hesitation, no need to confirm who I was. And I let a second pass before I responded, just enough time to align my thoughts into something precise. "I need you to initiate voting control," I said, my tone quiet, even, the kind of tone that does not invite discussion. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, not resistance, just the sound of someone processing a request that had been prepared for long before this moment arrived. "Effective immediately?" he asked, and I watched through the glass as Claire stepped down from the stage, surrounded now by people reaching for her attention, their faces lit with approval, their body language shifting subtly toward alignment with whatever direction she would take next, and I answered without looking away, "Effective immediately." And I could almost hear the shift on the other end of the line, the transition from conversation to execution, the quiet activation of structures that do not need to announce themselves to be real. "Understood," he said, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him. "Route it through the trust," I added, full authority. And this time the pause was slightly longer, not because he did not understand, but because he knew exactly what that meant, and I had not used those words in a very long time. Not since the day I set everything in place to ensure that moments like this would never leave me without options. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady, professional, but carrying the weight of what was being set in motion. "I will notify the board and update the control structure." And I lowered the phone slightly, just enough to shift my grip, and said, "No announcements yet," because timing still mattered, because there is a difference between a system changing and people realizing it has changed. And that gap is where most of the real consequences take shape. Let it settle first. And he understood that without needing further explanation. "Of course," he replied, and I ended the call with a simple tap. No ceremony, no hesitation, just the quiet conclusion of a decision that had already been made long before the phone ever left my pocket, and I stood there. For a moment longer, the phone still in my hand, feeling the subtle shift that most people would never notice. The invisible recalibration of authority that was already moving through channels far removed from the ballroom in front of me. And inside, nothing had changed yet, not visibly. The music resumed. The conversations continued. Claire laughed at something someone said, her posture relaxed, confident, entirely unaware that the structure supporting that moment had just been altered in a way she could not yet see. And I slipped the phone back into my coat, my hand brushing against the invitation as I did, and I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just controlled, the kind of breath that marks the completion of one phase and the beginning of another. And beside me the guard shifted again, glancing at me as if to confirm that I was finally leaving, and I gave him a small nod, not dismissive, not condescending, just acknowledgement, because he had done exactly what he was supposed to do. He had enforced the boundary that had been placed in front of him, and boundaries like that are only as strong as the systems behind them. And those systems had just changed, even if he did not know it yet. And I turned away from the doors, from the lights and the voices and the carefully constructed version of reality unfolding inside, and began to walk down the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying me further from the scene that had defined the evening and closer to the consequences that were already beginning to take shape. I did not look back as I walked down the hallway, but I did not need to, because I could already feel the shift beginning behind me. Subtle at first, the kind of change that does not announce itself with noise but with hesitation, with small interruptions in a rhythm that had been smooth just minutes before, and I have seen that pattern more times than I can count, in conference rooms, in negotiations, in moments where authority changes hands quietly, and the people inside the room sense it before they understand it. And I reached the end of the corridor where the polished marble gave way to a darker carpet near the elevators. And I stopped there for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I was listening, not with my ears, but with the part of me that recognizes when systems begin to move. And sure enough, My phone vibrated once in my pocket. A short, precise signal, not a call, just a notification, and I took it out slowly, glancing at the screen without urgency, and saw the first confirmation come through. A secure message, one line. No decoration, voting control updated. And I read it once then. Again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it settle fully into place, and I slipped the phone back into my pocket just as the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. And a couple stepped out, laughing quietly, their conversation light, unaware of anything beyond their evening plans, and they walked past me without a second glance, and that was the point. Nothing had changed for them, not yet, and for most people, it never would, because the structures that define their world operate far above their line of sight, invisible unless you know exactly where to look. And I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor, and as the doors closed, I caught one last reflection of myself in the mirrored wall, a man who looked exactly the same as he had 20 minutes ago, same suit, same posture, same calm expression. And yet everything connected to that reflection had just shifted in a way that could not be undone, and the elevator began its descent, smooth and controlled. And I let my mind move back through the years, not out of nostalgia, but out of precision, because every decision that had led to this moment had been made long before Claire ever stepped onto that stage, long before she learned how to navigate rooms like that. And I remembered the day I signed the original documents, the day I chose to place the majority of my shares into a trust instead of keeping them in my own name. A decision that had confused more than a few people at the time, but I have always believed that ownership is not just about possession, it is about control. And control requires structure, requires distance, requires the ability to act without needing permission from anyone who does not understand the full picture. And that structure had remained dormant for years, quietly holding its position, allowing others to believe whatever they needed to believe about who was in charge, about where the real authority sat. And I had no reason to challenge that perception, because it served its purpose. It allowed Claire to build her own path, to stand on her own in ways that mattered. But there is a difference between independence and erasure, and tonight had crossed that line. Not because of the guard, not because of the door, but because of the choice she made when she saw me and turned away. And that was the moment everything became clear, the moment the system I had built was no longer just a safeguard but a necessity. And the elevator reached the lobby with another soft chime, the doors opening to a wide, quiet space where a few late arrivals moved toward the event upstairs, their footsteps echoing lightly across the polished floor. And I stepped out, adjusting my jacket slightly, feeling the familiar weight of the evening settle into something controlled, something deliberate. And as I walked toward the exit, my phone vibrated again, this time twice in quick succession, and I did not need to check it immediately to know what it meant. The second wave, the notifications that follow once the initial change begins to propagate. Board members receiving updates, systems recalibrating access, small digital signals that would soon translate into very real consequences. And I pushed open the glass doors leading out to the parking area, the cool night air meeting me with a clarity that matched the one in my mind, and I paused there for a second, just outside the building, looking back up at the lit windows where the celebration was still in full swing, unchanged on the surface, and I knew that inside, somewhere between the stage and the executive tables, someone had just received a message that did not fit, a piece of information that would not align with the version of reality they believed they were operating in. And those moments, those small fractures, are where everything begins to come apart, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably. And I slipped my hands into my coat pockets again, standing there in the quiet, knowing that the night was far from over, and that the real part of the story had just begun. I stayed there for a moment longer, just outside the building, letting the quiet settle around me while everything inside continued as if nothing had changed. And that contrast has always been where the truth lies, not in the noise, not in the speeches or the applause, but in the gap between perception and reality. And I have spent most of my life operating in that gap, building things people could see while controlling things they never noticed. And as I stood there, I reached into my pocket. Again, this time not for confirmation, but for context, and I pulled out my phone, unlocking it with the same steady motion, and the screen lit up with a series of updates that had already begun to stack, secure messages, internal alerts, small fragments of a much larger shift, and I opened the first one, reading it without any visible reaction. Board acknowledgement received, followed by another. Executive access review initiated, and then a third, slightly longer, outlining the immediate adjustments to voting thresholds and authority alignment, all written in the precise, controlled language that systems like this rely on, language that does not dramatize, does not explain, it simply states what is now true, and I scrolled through them slowly, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to measure the speed of the response, the efficiency of the structure I had put in place years ago. And it was moving exactly as it should, clean, contained, without unnecessary friction, and that told me everything I needed to know, that the foundation was still intact, still capable of doing what it was designed to do. And I slipped the phone back into my pocket, lifting my eyes to the building again, to the upper floors where the lights still burned bright, where Claire was still standing in a room that no longer belonged to her in the way she believed it did, and I felt no urgency to go back inside. No need to confront anyone, because confrontation is a surface reaction. It creates noise without changing structure, and I have never been interested in noise, only in outcomes. And the outcome was already unfolding, piece by piece, whether anyone inside that room understood it yet or not. And I turned slightly, walking along the edge of the parking area, my steps slow, deliberate, not leaving entirely, just repositioning, because there is value in distance, in observing how events evolve once the initial change has been introduced. And I stopped near the far end of the lot, where the light from the building was softer, less direct, and from there I could still see the main entrance, the glass doors reflecting movement inside. And it did not take long for the first visible sign to appear, the same doors I had been turned away from opening again, but this time with a different energy, a man in a dark suit stepping out quickly, not rushed in a careless way, but focused, purposeful, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight, and I recognized the type immediately. Mid-level executive, someone important enough to be informed early, but not high enough to control the situation, and he paced a few steps away from the entrance, speaking in low, controlled tones, nodding once or twice as he listened. And then he turned back toward the doors, his posture already changed, more rigid, more aware, and that was how it starts. The information moving through the structure, altering behavior before it, alters outcomes, and a few seconds later, another figure appeared, this one older, more composed, stepping out with less visible urgency, but the same underlying tension, checking his phone before looking back inside, and I could almost trace the path of the information as it spread, from one person to another, from one level to the next, each one adjusting in real time to a reality they had not anticipated, and I stood there, hands in my pockets, watching it unfold without any need to intervene, because the system does not require presence to function, it requires design, and that design was already doing its work. And inside, I imagined Claire still surrounded by people who had not yet received the message, still smiling, still accepting congratulations, unaware that the foundation beneath her position had shifted in a way that would soon reach her, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a quiet, undeniable fact. And I thought back to the moment at the door, to the guard, to the simple statement that had set this entire sequence in motion, and I understood something with absolute clarity. That moments like that are never just about access. They are about definition, about who is recognized and who is dismissed, about who is included in the narrative and who is written out of it. And tonight, that definition had been made very clear, not by accident, not by misunderstanding, but by choice, and I had responded in the only way that matters, not by arguing for a place at the table, but by changing who owns the table entirely. And as I stood there watching the lights, watching the movement behind the glass, I knew that the next phase was already approaching, the moment when the information would reach Claire directly, when the version of reality she had been standing in would no longer hold. And I did not need to rush it, did not need to force it, because systems like this move at their own pace, precise, inevitable, and when they arrive, they do not ask for permission, they simply replace what was there before. It did not take long for the pattern to reach the next layer, because systems like this are designed to move upward just as efficiently as they move outward, and I saw it happen in real time as the energy at the entrance shifted again, more controlled now, more contained, as if the people stepping outside were trying not to draw attention to the fact that something had changed, and that was always the first instinct at that level, to manage perception before fully understanding reality. And a third figure emerged from the doors, this one unmistakably senior, his posture straight, his pace measured but firm, the kind of man who does not leave a room unless there is a reason, and he paused just outside the entrance, looking around briefly before his gaze settled on the two others who had already stepped out, and I watched as they moved closer together, their conversation quiet but intense, heads slightly inclined, shoulders drawn in just enough to signal that this was no longer routine, and even from a distance, I could see the shift in their expressions, the subtle tightening around the eyes, the controlled stillness that comes when information arrives that cannot be ignored, and I did not need to hear what they were saying to understand the structure of it, the questions being asked, the confirmations being sought, the realization forming that the authority they had assumed was stable had just been altered without warning. And I slipped one hand deeper into my coat pocket, feeling the familiar edge of the invitation still there, a small, almost insignificant object compared to what was now unfolding. And yet it marked the exact point where this entire sequence had begun, and I thought about that for a moment, about how often people underestimate the weight of a single decision, a single moment where they choose to include or exclude, to acknowledge or dismiss, not realizing that those moments reveal more than they intend. They expose the underlying structure of belief, of loyalty, of alignment. And once that structure is visible, it can be measured. And once it can be measured, it can be changed. And I looked back up at the building, focusing again on the windows above, on the faint movement of figures inside. And it was there that I saw the next shift. Not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. The subtle clustering of attention around a different point in the room. The way conversations began to fragment, small groups forming and dissolving more quickly than before. The rhythm no longer smooth, no longer unified. And that was when I knew the information had reached the floor. Not everyone yet, not fully, but enough to disrupt the flow, enough to create questions that could not be answered with the script that had been prepared for the evening. And I imagined the sequence inside. The quiet interruption, a phone vibrating, a glance at a screen, a message read and then read again. The initial disbelief followed by the need to confirm, to verify, to understand how something like this could happen without their awareness. And then the realization that it had already happened, that the structure had shifted without needing their acknowledgement. And that realization changes people. It forces them to reassess their position in real time, to reconsider every assumption they had been operating under just minutes before, and I watched as the senior executive outside straightened slightly, his posture adjusting in a way that signaled a decision had been made, not about what to do yet, but about how seriously to take what he had just learned. And he turned back toward the doors, pausing only briefly as if to collect himself before stepping inside again, and the others followed, their movements more controlled now, more deliberate, as if they were stepping into a different room than the one they had left, even though nothing about it had physically changed, and I remained where I was, still, quiet, allowing the sequence to continue without interference, because interference at this stage would only disrupt the clarity of the outcome, and clarity was the only thing that mattered now. Clarity about who understood what, clarity about how quickly they adapted, clarity about where the lines would be drawn once the full weight of the change settled in. And I knew that the next moment would not be at the door, it would be inside, at the center of the room, where Claire stood, because eventually, information like this always finds its way to the person it affects most, not as a rumor, not as speculation, but as a direct, undeniable fact. And when that moment came, it would not need to be announced. It would be visible in the smallest details, in the shift of posture, in the change of tone, in the way the room itself responded. And I exhaled slowly, my breath steady in the cool night air, knowing that I did not need to move, did not need to approach, because the distance between us had already been defined earlier that evening. And now it was her turn to cross it, whether she was ready to or not. The moment did not arrive with a loud announcement or a dramatic interruption. It never does. It came quietly, almost invisibly, like a shift in pressure that only a few people feel at first, and then everyone else begins to notice without understanding why. And I saw it happen through the glass, not in one single action, but in a sequence of small changes that built on each other until the entire room felt different. And it started with Claire, because it always does, the center point where everything converges. And at first she was still moving through the room the same way she had before, smiling, nodding, accepting congratulations, her posture steady, her gestures precise. But then there was a pause, a slight break in her rhythm as someone approached her. One of the executives I had seen step outside moments earlier, and he did not greet her the way the others had. There was no extended smile, no casual ease. Instead, he leaned in slightly, speaking low, controlled, and I watched her expression closely, because that is where truth reveals itself first, not in words, but in the microseconds before someone decides how to respond. And I saw it there. The flicker, the moment where the information reached her and did not immediately fit into the structure she had been operating within, her eyes narrowing just slightly, her smile holding a fraction longer than it should have, as if waiting for confirmation from somewhere else. And then she nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and the man stepped back, his posture already shifting, already recalibrating his position relative to her. And that was when the change began to spread outward in a way that everyone could feel. Conversations that had been fluid became shorter, more contained. People who had been leaning in began to step back, creating space where there had been none before. And I saw Claire adjust, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the subtle ways that matter, her shoulders tightening just slightly, her gaze moving more deliberately now, scanning the room not for connection, but for information, for alignment. And that was the moment she understood that something had changed, even if she did not yet understand exactly what. And I could almost trace the questions forming in her mind, the attempt to reconcile what she was being told with what she believed to be true, because up until that point, her position had been clear, defined, supported by everything around her. And now that support was shifting, not collapsing, not disappearing, but moving in ways that no longer centered on her. And I watched as another person approached, then another, each interaction shorter than the last, each one adding another layer to the realization that the structure she was standing on was no longer stable in the way it had been just minutes before. And there is a moment in situations like this where people make a choice, not consciously, not in words, but in behavior. They decide whether to hold their position or to begin adjusting to the new reality. And I saw that moment in Claire as clearly as I had seen her turn away from me earlier, her posture straightening again, her chin lifting slightly, as if she could maintain control simply by refusing to acknowledge the shift. And for a brief second, it almost worked. The room hesitated, uncertain which version of reality to align with, the one that had been presented at the start of the evening or the one that was now emerging beneath it. And then it tipped, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a simple, unmistakable change in attention. The senior executive I had seen earlier moved toward her, not quickly, not urgently, but with purpose. And when he reached her, he did not wait for an opening. He did not follow the pattern of polite conversation. He spoke directly, his expression controlled but firm. And this time, the reaction was different. There was no delay, no attempt to maintain the previous rhythm. Claire's smile disappeared completely, replaced by something quieter, more focused, her eyes locking onto his as he spoke. And I knew then that she had received the full message, not a fragment, not a hint, but the complete, undeniable reality of what had just happened. And for the first time that evening, she looked toward the doors again, not casually, not as part of a passing glance, but directly, intentionally. And even from where I stood, I could feel the weight of that look, because it was no longer about recognition. It was about understanding, about connecting the moment at the door with the shift now unfolding around her. And in that instant, the distance between us changed, not physically, but structurally, because now she knew exactly who had been standing outside, and more importantly, what that meant. And I did not move, did not step forward, did not signal in any way, because this was not a moment that required my presence to be understood. It required only the realization that the version of the story she had been telling herself no longer held. And I stood there in the quiet, watching as the room adjusted around her, as the celebration that had been so carefully constructed began to take on a different tone, not ending, not collapsing, but shifting into something else entirely, something that no longer belonged to her in the way it had just minutes before, and I knew that the next move would be hers, not because she had control, but because she had no choice. I watched her for a few seconds longer after that moment of realization, not because I expected anything dramatic, but because I knew how people respond when the ground shifts beneath them. And Claire had always been precise, controlled, someone who learned early how to hold herself together in front of others. And that was exactly what she did now. She did not panic. She did not draw attention. Instead, she nodded once more to the executive in front of her, said something brief that I could not hear, and then stepped back, not away from the room entirely, but just enough to create space around herself. And that space told me everything, because it was no longer the space of someone being celebrated. It was the space of someone recalculating. And I saw her glance at her phone. Quick, subtle, the kind of movement most people would miss. But I knew what she was looking for: confirmation, context, something to anchor the information she had just received into something she could act on. And whatever she saw there did not give her that, because her expression tightened again, not visibly to anyone who was not paying attention, but enough for me to recognize it. And then she looked toward the entrance once more, not scanning this time, not uncertain, but directly, as if measuring the distance between where she stood and where I had been. And that was when she moved, not quickly, not in a way that would disrupt the room, but with intention, stepping through the clusters of people who instinctively made space for her, though not with the same energy as before, not with the same automatic deference. And that difference, subtle as it was, followed her as she crossed the floor, a shift in the way conversations paused instead of leaned in the way attention lingered a fraction longer than necessary. And I knew she could feel it too, because once you notice that change, you cannot ignore it. And she reached the edge of the room where the doors stood, the same doors that had been closed to me just minutes earlier. And for a second she stopped there, her hand resting lightly against the handle, her posture straight, composed, but not entirely steady. And I could almost see the thought passing through her mind, the recognition of the exact point where everything had begun to change. And then she pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway, her eyes scanning the space immediately, searching, and I did not move. I remained where I was outside, far enough that she would not see me right away, but close enough to watch the sequence continue. And I saw the moment she realized I was not there, not at the door, not in the immediate space where she expected me to be. And that realization carried its own weight, because it meant she had to look further, to step beyond the controlled environment of the event and into something less predictable. And she took a few steps forward, her pace measured, her gaze moving with more urgency now. And then she saw the executives who had stepped out earlier, standing off to the side, their posture still tense, their attention shifting toward her as she approached. And I watched as she spoke to them, her tone low but direct, asking questions that did not need to be heard to be understood. And I saw the answers reflected in her face as they responded, not evasive, not uncertain, but clear, confirming what she had already begun to piece together. And that was when her composure shifted again, not breaking, but adjusting, recalibrating in real time, her shoulders lowering slightly, as if releasing something she had been holding on to. And her gaze moved once more, this time beyond them, beyond the entrance, out toward the parking area where I stood. And it did not take long for her to find me, because once you know what you are looking for, distance becomes irrelevant. And our eyes met again, not through glass this time, not separated by a barrier that allowed for denial, but directly, with nothing in between except the space she had to cross. And I saw the full recognition settle in, not just of who I was, but of what had just happened, of the connection between the man she had chosen to ignore and the shift that was now reshaping everything around her. And I did not wave, did not call out, did not move toward her, because this was not a moment that required invitation, it required decision. And she stood there for a second, just long enough for that decision to take shape, before she began to walk toward me, leaving the entrance behind, leaving the room behind, stepping into the space that had been defined earlier that evening. Only now the roles within that space were no longer the same. She walked toward me with a pace that was controlled but no longer effortless, each step measured as if she were recalculating distance not just in feet, but in meaning. And I remained where I was, hands still in my coat pockets, posture unchanged, because movement now would only interrupt what needed to happen. And I have learned that the most powerful position in moments like this is stillness, the kind that forces the other person to close the gap on their own. And as she moved across the lot, the light from the building behind her faded slightly, softening the sharp edges of the scene, leaving just enough illumination to see her clearly without the distractions of the room she had just left. And I watched her expression closely, not searching for emotion, but for structure, for the way she was assembling what had just happened into something she could stand on. And when she was about 10 feet away, she slowed, not stopping yet, but adjusting her pace as if the final steps required more precision than the ones before. And then she came to a halt a few feet in front of me, close enough that there was no ambiguity left, no distance to hide behind. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to acknowledge everything that had already been said without words. And then she inhaled slightly, steadying herself. Her voice, when it came low and controlled, "Is it true?" she said, not asking for details, not asking for explanation, just confirmation. And I held her gaze without shifting, without softening, because this was not a moment for comfort, it was a moment for clarity. "Yes," I said, simple, direct, and I watched the impact of that single word move through her, not as shock, not as disbelief, but as alignment, as the final piece of information settling into place. And she nodded once, slowly, her eyes dropping for a brief second before returning to mine, and I could see the calculation continuing behind them, the rapid reassessment of everything she thought she understood about her position, her authority, the narrative she had been presenting to that room. And for a moment it seemed like she might say something else, something defensive, something to reframe what had happened at the door, but she did not. And that told me more than any words could have, because it meant she understood that this was not about a single moment. It was about a sequence of decisions, including her own, and she shifted her weight slightly, her posture adjusting in a way that was almost imperceptible, but significant, the subtle lowering of certainty, the quiet acknowledgement that the ground beneath her had changed. And when she spoke again, her tone was different, not weaker, but more deliberate. "You could have told me," she said, and I let that sit for a second before responding, because statements like that are rarely about information. They are about responsibility, about who is expected to bridge the gap when something breaks. And I answered her the only way that made sense within the reality we were standing in. "I was at the door," I said, my voice even, not accusatory, not raised, just factual. And the meaning of it landed immediately, not as an argument, but as a mirror, reflecting back the exact point where the choice had been made. And I saw it register, the connection between that moment and everything that had followed. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, not in defeat, but in recognition. And for a brief second, the version of her that had stood under the lights inside seemed very far away, replaced by something quieter, something more grounded. And she glanced back toward the building, toward the door she had just come through, where the event was still continuing, though no longer in the same way. And when she looked back at me, there was a different kind of focus in her eyes, not the practiced confidence from before, but something more direct, more honest. And I could see the question forming before she spoke it, not about the past, not about the moment at the door, but about what came next. Because that is always where people go once they understand that the structure has changed. And she took a small step closer, closing the last bit of distance between us, her voice steady but quieter now. "What happens now?" she asked, and I held her gaze for a moment, not answering immediately, because the answer was not a simple one, not something that could be given in a single sentence, and more importantly, it was not something I was going to define for her in that moment. And I let the silence return briefly, not to create tension, but to allow the weight of the question to settle, because the truth was already there, in everything that had just happened, in every decision that had led to this point. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, the same as it had been all evening. "Now," I said, "you decide what that room means without me in it." And I watched her absorb that, not as an instruction, but as a shift in responsibility. And for the first time since she stepped outside, there was no attempt to control the moment, no attempt to reshape it into something else, just a quiet, unmistakable understanding that the rules she had been operating under were no longer the same. She did not answer immediately after I said that. And that silence was different from the ones before, not uncertain, not searching, but heavy with the kind of understanding that does not come all at once. It settles in layers, each one reshaping the last. And I could see it happening in her posture, in the way her shoulders held steady but no longer carried the same certainty, in the way her gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but inward, as if she were recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the position she had just been standing in. And for a moment, the noise from the building behind us drifted out again as the doors opened briefly. Laughter, music, the continuation of an event that no longer held the same meaning for either of us. And she glanced back toward it. Not long, just enough to register that it was still happening, that the room had not stopped simply because its structure had changed. And that realization seemed to settle something in her. Because when she looked back at me, there was less resistance in her expression, less of the instinct to defend what had already been exposed, and more of a quiet, deliberate focus on what remained. And she nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something she could not yet fully articulate. And then she spoke again, her voice lower now, steadier in a different way. "They are already reacting," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. And I inclined my head slightly, a small acknowledgement of what she already understood, because there was no point in explaining what she could see unfolding in real time. And she exhaled again, this time more controlled, her eyes shifting briefly toward the executives still near the entrance, who were now watching from a distance, their attention divided between us and the room behind them. And I knew she could feel that as well, the shift in how she was being perceived, not as the center of the evening anymore, but as a variable, something to be assessed rather than automatically supported. And that is a difficult transition for anyone, especially when it happens in the span of minutes. And she seemed to recognize that, because she straightened slightly, not to reclaim the same authority, but to hold her position in a different way, one that did not rely on assumptions that were no longer valid. And she took a breath before speaking again. "I did not know," she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to justify, just a simple statement. And I watched her carefully, because words like that can mean many things. They can be avoidance, they can be strategy, or they can be truth. And in this moment, it felt closer to the last, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them, without emphasis, without expectation, just as a fact she was placing between us. And I considered it for a second before responding, not dismissing it, but not allowing it to redirect the focus either. "You knew enough," I said, my tone even, not harsh, not soft, just clear. And she did not argue. She did not push back. She simply held my gaze and let that settle. And that told me more than any explanation could have, because it meant she understood the difference between not knowing everything and choosing what to do with what you do know. And the night air shifted slightly around us, a faint breeze moving through the lot, carrying with it the distant sound of a car pulling in somewhere behind us, grounding the moment in something ordinary, something outside the structure we had just been discussing. And she glanced down for a brief second, her hands coming together in front of her, fingers interlacing loosely, not in nervousness, but in concentration. And when she looked back up, there was a different kind of steadiness in her expression, not the practiced confidence from earlier, not the initial recalibration from moments ago, but something more deliberate, more aware of its own limits. And she asked the question that mattered, not about the event, not about the people inside, but about the system itself. "How much changes?" she said. And I knew exactly what she was asking, not just in terms of authority, but in terms of consequence, in terms of how far the shift would reach and what it would take with it. And I let a brief pause pass before answering, not to create tension, but to give the weight of the answer the space it required. "Enough," I said, my voice calm, measured, "that nothing inside that room is the same anymore." And I watched her absorb that, not with shock, but with a quiet acceptance, because by now she had already seen the first signs of it, already felt the shift in how people were responding to her. And she nodded again, slower this time, as if aligning herself with a reality she could no longer avoid. And for a moment we stood there without speaking, the distance between us no longer defined by the door or the room, but by the decisions that had brought us to this point. And I could see that she understood that as well, because there was no attempt to step back, no attempt to return to the version of the evening that had existed before, just a steady presence in the moment as it was now. And behind her, the doors opened once more, and one of the executives stepped out again, this time looking directly toward us, his expression composed but intent, as if waiting for something, for a signal, for direction. And I saw Claire notice him out of the corner of her eye, saw the brief flicker of awareness as she recognized that she was no longer operating in isolation, that every movement from this point forward would be observed, interpreted, and responded to. And that realization settled into her posture, not as pressure, but as clarity. And she turned her attention back to me, holding my gaze with a steadiness that had finally aligned with the reality of the situation. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next would not be defined by what had happened at the door, but by how she chose to move from here, within a structure that had changed in ways she could no longer ignore. The executive who had stepped out did not approach immediately, and that hesitation was not accidental. It was calculated, the kind of pause that allows space for hierarchy to reveal itself before action is taken, and I watched him stand there just beyond the doorway, his posture composed but attentive, his eyes moving between Claire and me as if measuring not just our positions, but the relationship between them. And Claire noticed it too, not directly at first, but in the way her focus shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence without turning fully toward him. And that subtle awareness told me she understood what was happening now, that the next move would not just be personal, it would be observed, interpreted, and likely followed. And she took a small breath, steadying herself again. And then she did something that mattered more than anything she had said so far. She did not turn back toward the room. She did not retreat into the structure that had just shifted beneath her. Instead, she stayed where she was, facing me, holding her ground in a space that was no longer defined by titles or positions. And for a moment, the three of us existed in that quiet alignment, the observer at the door, the subject of the shift, and the source of it standing a few feet apart, connected by a sequence of decisions that could no longer be undone. And Claire spoke again, her voice still low but carrying a new kind of clarity. "If I walk back in there," she said, not finishing the sentence, not needing to, because the question was already complete, and I let the implication settle before responding, because the answer was not about what she would say or how she would present herself. It was about what she understood, and I answered simply, "They will follow what you show them." And I saw that land, not as reassurance, but as responsibility, because it meant that whatever she did next would define not just her position, but the shape of the room itself. And she glanced once more toward the entrance, toward the executive who was still waiting, and this time she did not avoid it. She met his gaze directly, and I watched as something passed between them, not words, not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement that the structure had changed and that both of them were now operating within that new reality. And the executive inclined his head slightly, a small gesture, but one that carried weight, because it was no longer directed at the version of her that had been celebrated earlier. It was directed at the person she was choosing to be now. And Claire turned back to me, and for a second, there was something unguarded in her expression, not weakness, not uncertainty, but the absence of performance. The first moment of the evening where she was not aligning herself to the expectations of a room, but to something internal, something more stable. And she nodded once, not to me, but to the decision forming within her. And then she stepped back, just one step, creating a small but deliberate distance between us, not to separate, but to mark the transition from one phase to another. And she spoke again, her tone steady, clear. "I understand," she said, and I believed her, not because of the words, but because of everything that had led to them, the way she had processed, adjusted, and arrived at this point without trying to deny what was in front of her. And I inclined my head slightly in return, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because this was not about agreement, it was about recognition. And she turned then, finally, toward the entrance, toward the room that had already begun to change in her absence. And as she took her first step back in that direction, the executive moved to meet her, not rushing, not leading, but aligning, and they exchanged a few quiet words, brief, efficient, and then together they moved back toward the doors, and I watched as she reached them, her hand resting on the handle for just a second, the same position she had been in moments earlier, but everything about it was different now. The context, the awareness, the understanding of what that door represented, and she pushed it open, stepping back inside. not as someone returning to the same place, but as someone entering a different version of it entirely, and the executive followed, the doors closing behind them with a soft, controlled motion that sealed the shift inside, and I remained where I was, still, quiet, the night air settling around me again, and I did not need to see what was happening inside to know that the room was no longer the same, that the balance had changed in ways that would continue to unfold long after the music stopped and the lights dimmed, because moments like this do not end when the event does. They extend, they reshape, they redefine what comes next, and I slipped my hands back into my coat pockets, standing there for a moment longer, not waiting, not expecting anything more from the evening, because everything that mattered had already happened, not in the room, not on the stage, but in the quiet decisions made just outside of it. I remained where I was for a while after the doors closed, not because I was waiting for anything to happen, but because I understood that some moments deserve to settle before you walk away from them. And this was one of those moments, not defined by what was visible on the surface, but by what had shifted underneath, and I looked up at the windows again, at the light still pouring out from the ballroom. And though I could not see her clearly anymore, I could imagine exactly what was happening. Inside, not in detail, but in structure, the conversations that would now carry a different tone, the questions that would be asked more carefully, the way people would begin aligning themselves with the new reality rather than the one they had assumed just an hour ago. And I knew Claire was in the center of that, not as the same figure who had stood under the banner earlier, but as someone who now understood the weight of what she stood on. And that understanding changes everything, not immediately, not perfectly, but in ways that cannot be reversed. And I let out a slow breath, the kind that marks the end of a sequence rather than the release of tension, because there was no tension left in me, only clarity, and I turned slightly, my eyes moving away from the building for the first time since the night had begun, toward the darker edge of the lot where the lights did not reach as strongly, and I started walking, my steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying me further from the scene that had defined the evening. And as I moved, my phone vibrated once more in my pocket, a single notification, and I took it out, glancing at the screen without stopping, and the message was simple, just a confirmation that the updated control structure had been fully acknowledged across all necessary channels. Nothing more, nothing less. And I slipped the phone back into my pocket, not needing to respond, because there was nothing left to initiate. Everything that needed to be set in motion already had been. And as I reached my car, I paused for a moment with my hand on the door, looking back one last time at the building, not out of attachment, but out of recognition, because places like that hold more than events. They hold decisions. They reflect the people who move through them. And tonight it had reflected something clearly, something that could not be ignored or rewritten. And I thought briefly of the moment at the door, of the guard who had simply followed instructions, of the line that had been drawn without knowing what stood on the other side of it. And I understood that it had never really been about him, or even about the door itself. It had been about what that moment revealed, about how easily someone can be dismissed when they are no longer recognized, and how quickly that dismissal can define everything that follows. And I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The interior quiet, contained, separate from the world I had just stepped away from. And for a second I sat there without starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and I allowed myself one final thought, not about control, not about ownership, but about responsibility, because that is what remains after everything else shifts, not the title, not the position, but the understanding of what you hold and what you choose to do with it. And I knew that Claire now carried that understanding in a way she had not before, not because I had told her, but because she had experienced it. And experiences like that do not fade. They reshape. They stay with you long after the night ends. And I started the engine, the sound low and steady, and pulled out of the lot, leaving the building behind, not as something I had lost or reclaimed, but as something that had been set back into its proper place. And as I drove away, the lights in the rearview mirror growing smaller with each passing second, I felt no need to look back again, because everything that mattered had already been seen, understood, and quietly put in motion.